Jules Verne, the first author to succeed financially writing science fiction, published zestful voyages extraordinaires, like Around the World in 80 Days, the first Western novel translated into Japanese. Despite his popularity, he was long considered a mere children's author, in part because many readers' misunderstanding of his Gallic humor and their lack of factual knowledge obscured his social satire. That satire runs throughout 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, as does his enthusiasm for science. Most of Verne's works were Robinsonades, fantasies of intellectual conquest that, like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, sought less to explore the alien than to recreate it in our image. In the European imagination, America was the paramount landscape for recreation. So Verne uses America in works like From the Earth to the Moon and his utopian The Begum's Millions, thus solidifying the enduring connection between the idea of America and the genre of science fiction. Jules Verne was born and raised on an island in the Loire River port city of Nantes and fantasized his entire life about travel. He was sent by his father to Paris to study law, but while there, he also wrote plays and stories, not really focusing on his legal studies at all, but having almost no success with his writing. He wrote a novel which he sent to Pierre-Jules Hetzel. Hetzel was a publisher of books and the family-oriented periodical called Magasin d'éducation et de récréation, that is, the magazine of education and of recreation. As I say, this was a family-oriented magazine, one intended not only for the children, but for the parents. Hetzel read the manuscript and advised some drastic changes. Add humor. Cut out excessive science. Have a happy ending instead of an unhappy ending. Verne took the advice. Hetzel published the novel in his magazine in 1863, and 5 Weeks in a Balloon was an instant hit. This was a story about people suspended from the gondola of a balloon who go across Africa and basically come to understand what they see. The reaction was so overwhelming that Verne signed an agreement to deliver 2 books a year of this type to Hetzel, many of them following exactly that formula, which came to be called Voyages Extraordinaires, Extraordinary Voyage. And most of the Voyages Extraordinaires that Verne produced were in fact published in Hetzel's periodical, even after Hetzel's own death. Verne's key traits are visible from the very opening of 5 Weeks in a Balloon. There was a large audience assembled on the 14th of January, 1862, at the session of the Royal Geographical Society, number 3 Waterloo Place, London. Notice already that we have a social setting. We have a gathering of people. The key people here are, in fact, people of intellect, the Royal Geographical Society. The rhetoric that we see here is the same rhetoric of science that we saw Poe using. That is, we have specific details, external data, we have numbers wherever possible. And notice that this is set in London. Although Verne is a Frenchman, he wants to have Englishmen be his characters here because ultimately, as we will see later, he's going to make fun of them. The president, Sir Francis M., made an important communication to his colleagues in an address that was frequently interrupted by applause. This rare specimen of eloquence terminated with the following sonorous phrases bubbling over with patriotism. And so now we can already see that Verne is going to be making fun of the English for their overly patriotic attitudes, at the same time that he is enthusiastic about their desire to add to knowledge. England has always marched at the head of nations. For, the reader will observe, the nations always march at the head of each other. by the intrepidity of her explorers in the line of geographical discovery, general assent. Dr. Samuel Ferguson, one of her most glorious sons, will not reflect discredit on his origin. No, indeed, from all parts of the hall. This attempt, should it succeed, it will succeed, will complete and link together the notions as yet disjointed which the world entertains of African cartology. Vehement applause. And should it fail, it will at least remain on record as one of the most daring conceptions of human genius. Tremendous cheering. That's just the very opening of 5 Weeks in a Balloon. We see there, then, the key traits of Verne. Teasing satire that both pokes fun at and embraces its target. A satire based on national, sometimes racial, and sometimes other stereotypes, and the adventure of three cartographers, which in fact is primarily voyeuristic. A cartographer, or a cartologist as this book would have it, is not someone who interacts with the alien environment, but someone who floats above it and simply comes to name it, to decide how it fits. With the success of his writing, in 1868, just 5 years after he published 5 Weeks in a Balloon, Verne was able to buy a boat, which he called his floating study. He named it the Saint Michel. The Saint Michel is named after the famous monastery en Mont Saint Michel on the Norman coast. Mont Saint Michel has an interesting geography. The way the tides work in that part of the world, for half of the day, Mont Saint Michel is an island. For the other half of the day, when the waves are high, when the waves are low, Mont Saint Michel is connected to the mainland by a causeway. In other words, it both is and isn't attached to the land. Verne had wanted to be a seafarer like his brother Paul, who eventually became a captain. However, it turned out that Verne got seasick. So Jules instead bought his floating study and mostly kept it tethered in the Seine, where he went to work knowing that he could travel, but in fact his travel took place in his mind. In 1872, he published a little-known work today, that is, it's today little-known, but it's one I enjoy very much, called Dr. Oxes Experiment. I like it because it shows something important about Verne's use of stereotypes. You know, in English, we often make jokes, for better or for probably worse, that say, well, there was this Polish fellow. And as we are all aware, in Canada they make jokes about this Newfie, the fellow from Newfoundland. And in England they make jokes about the Irish. And in France they make jokes about the Belgians. Dr. Ox's experiment is set in a sleepy Belgian town, in which Dr. Ox comes and tries to see if he can invigorate the people by, without their knowledge, sending into their theater this newly discovered gas called oxygen. Oxygen, it turns out, makes things burn. You add oxygen to a fire and it becomes much more vigorous. And so, this fellow, with the help of his assistant, add tubes underneath the floorboards of the local theater. And during performances, they pump in oxygen. Well, the people in this town get to be a whole lot more lively, and we have all kinds of interesting phenomena take place. We have perfectly good, stable marriages that devolve into randy affairs with neighbors' husbands and wives. We have children running wild through the streets. And the whole of the story, really, is just to see how silly these Belgians become once they are changed by this modern scientific discovery. The assistant, by the way, is a fellow named Eugène. And the punchline of the story, of course, is that this Belgian village has been set into turmoil by the applications of Ox, Eugène. It's basically an extended joke based on stereotypes. It embraces science, it teases science, it embraces stereotype, it teases stereotype, but it's ultimately enthusiastic and good-hearted. That is Verne. His most popular novel was Around the World in 80 Days, published in 1873. In this novel, a man named Phileas Fogg accepts a challenge to go around the world within 80 days. With him he takes his faithful servant, Passepartout, which means goes along everywhere, and in the course of going around the world, they manage to save a maiden, they tame the American West, and Phileas Fogg, in fact, wins his bet. Verne, in that same year, used his increasing proceeds to buy the Saint-Michel II. He was, in fact, the first science fiction writer in history to live, and indeed live very well, solely by his pen. But in a sense, this delightful story of one adventure after another in which the staid fellow remains himself no matter where he goes was hardly science fiction. 16 years later, a period during which it's true the final link of the American Transcontinental Railway was completed, but otherwise no really major changes in world transportation, an American journalist named Nellie Bly decided to see if she could go around the world in 80 days. And in fact, she succeeded in going around the world in reality in 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes. In other words, she beat Phileas Fogg's time by 10%. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, to me, epitomizes Verne when he writes true science fiction. This is a story told from the viewpoint of a Professor Aronnax. Professor Aronnax also has a faithful servant, this one named Conseil, which means counsel. The other main characters in this story are a Canadian harpooner named Ned Land. Isn't that just the most earthy, reliable name you could think of? Ned Land. And, as we will see soon, a mysterious submarine captain named Nemo. The book opens with the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic being depredated by some unknown mechanism. Ships are struck below the waterline and sinking. All of North Atlantic shipping is in danger. Who should be sent out to save the day? Why, naturally enough, America. And the Abraham Lincoln is the frigate that goes out to save everyone. Commodore Farragut, late a hero of the American Civil War, commands the Abraham Lincoln. And on this boat we have Pierre Aronnax, world-famous French zoologist. Why? Because the debate is this. Is the shipping danger nothing but what is called in the book a great unicorn fish? Is it a narwhal that somehow with its single horn is stabbing holes in wooden vessels below the waterline? Or is it what is called a submarine monitor? The Monitor, of course, is the ironclad vessel in the American Civil War, and the word submarine at this time in the history of both French and English is still only an adjective. A submarine monitor, one that goes below the surface of the sea. In fact, Nemo will turn out to be a polymath, a misanthrope, and an idealist who takes the other three characters on a fantastic world tour. So, like 5 Weeks in a Balloon, we have fundamentally a voyage extraordinaire. Verne uses stereotypes, as always, to tease all of his characters. For example, he teases the scientist himself. Aronnax, early on in the book, is talking to Ned Land about the two competing theories, the unicorn fish and the submarine monitor. Well, he says, to Ned, you still believe in the possibility of an enormous whale? Yes, Ned, and my conviction is based on logic and facts. Professor Aronnax has logically concluded there must be a unicorn fish. I believe it to be a powerfully built mammal belonging to the subkingdom of the vertebrates, like whales, cachalots, and dolphins, and armed with a tusk of great penetrating power. Said the harpooner, shaking his head with the look of a man who did not want to be convinced. But you must remember, I replied, that if such an animal exists, if it inhabits the ocean depths, and if it lives in those layers of water situated several miles below the surface, then it must be built in some incredibly powerful way. Why? Ned asked. Because incalculable strength is needed to stay at great depths and withstand the pressure there. Really? Said Ned, blinking. Yes, and I could give you some figures to prove it easily. Oh, figures, answered Ned. You can make figures do whatever you want. Perhaps in business, Ned, but not in mathematics. Just another sly little bit of satire that Verne throws in. Now listen. The pressure of one atmosphere is represented by a column of water 32 feet high. In actual fact, the column of water would not be that high because here we're dealing with seawater, which has a greater density than fresh water. And Aronnax goes on to explain that each time we go down 32 feet, we go up by 1 order of magnitude, that the pressure on us is 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 32 feet, it would be 147 pounds per square inch, and so on and so forth. And at one point he says, and do you know how many square inches there are on your body? And of course, Ned Land says no. And Professor Aronnax tells him and multiplies that by the pressure. Well, that's actually bad science. And Verne knew that. The pressure on your body does not go up depending upon the size of your body. The pressure is per square inch, no matter how many square inches you have. But after Aronnax gets done with all of this description, he says that, in fact, only a mammal could stand this pressure. And Aronnax says, why, if that's so, then he must have skin like steel plates 8 inches thick. And of course, what we later find out is that Ned Land, in his easy simplicity, has understood what Professor Aronnax has not. The Abraham Lincoln is struck by the submarine, and Aronnax is thrown overboard. So is Ned Land, floating in the water. After a while, he looks around, and here comes Conseil, pushing a beam toward him. Conseil, I didn't see you get pushed over, Aronnax says. And Conseil says, monsieur, I thought perhaps you would need my help, and so I dived in after you. This is how the story begins, and they go everywhere. They meet Nemo, and they look through his extraordinary submarine, the Nautilus. In that Nautilus, they are taken first to see the wonders of the world in Nemo's own museum, where he has examples of sea life from everywhere, and an enormous array of books, which Aronnax notices are arranged by subject regardless of the language in which they're written. Nemo is truly a man of the world. He is, in a way, no man, like the name that Odysseus uses to fool the Cyclops as he takes his lengthy trip around the Mediterranean world. These trips make us as readers quite delighted. But as critics have looked at works like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they have decided that the book really is only for children. Modern readers miss the satire, for instance, in part because they think that Verne just likes the science, and they see these endless passages of discussion. For example, when Conseil discusses taxonomy in the museum samples with Ned Land, Conseil divides things by all of their phyla, families, and so on, but Ned Land says, well, I divide fish into those that are good to eat and those that aren't. The idea that Verne wrote primarily for children, I think, comes from a mistaken understanding of Hetzel's publication. It wasn't intended merely for children. It was intended for children and their family and their parents. Also, there's been misguided praise for Verne as predictive. And that predictive power we often find we're frustrated by, because when we learn more history, we realize that Verne was not really much of a predictor at all. In the American Civil War in 1864, the Confederate submarine Hunley actually sank the Northern frigate Housatonic in Charleston Harbor. It's true the crew of the Hunley died in the attempt, but the fact of the matter is that all over the European and North Atlantic world, people knew that as recently as a decade earlier, a submarine had really existed and had really brought down a ship. Verne predicted nothing in predicting the submarine, only predicting that eventually submarines would be better, which of course was no great prediction at all. The voyages extraordinaires, the trips we take all around the world with Verne, fall into a larger category of works called Robinsonades. Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe, was published in 1719. It's a famous story of someone who gets stranded on an island after a shipwreck. If you think about this story, really what Robinson tries to do is recreate Europe on that island. He continually goes back to the wreckage of a ship to pull things out that he can use. For me, when I read it first as a youngster, one of the most powerful passages in the book was the one after Robinson has become feverishly sick. From the moment he gets to the island, he keeps track of the day by making a mark on a board. He builds himself a hut. He eventually builds palisades around this area so that he has an enclosure. He eventually has goats. He has a whole little economy growing there, and he wants desperately to have this European-style mini-village be somehow in accord with Europe. But sometime he falls ill, and he doesn't know if in his delirium he has been out of contact with the daily sunrise and sunset for 1, 2, or 3 days. And he realizes, looking at the board that now has many, many, many marks on it, that he will not be able to know for sure if he celebrates Christmas at the right time. That's what creates a sense of alienation in Robinson. Not being on the island, but not being able to make the island into Europe. The most famous encounter on this island is that between Robinson and the character we come to call Friday. Friday was being chased by cannibals, and Robinson manages to drive them off with his gun, something that he has from Europe. He's pulled from the shipwreck. Here is the passage in which he has now brought this non-European back to his enclosure. Then, calling away, I carried him not to my castle, but quite away to my cave on the farther part of the island. So I did not let my dream come to pass in that part, that he came into my grove for shelter. Here I gave him bread and a bunch of raisins to eat. Notice that what we have here is bread and not yet wine, since raisins are dried grapes rather than fermented grapes. We have a very abstemious kind of communion going on here. Here I gave him bread and a bunch of raisins to eat, and a draught of water, which I found he was indeed in great distress for, from his running. And having refreshed him, I made signs for him to go and lie down to sleep, showing him a place where I had laid some rice straw and a blanket upon it, which I used to sleep upon myself sometimes. I can't help but think of this straw and this isolated human being who has appeared magically from nowhere as somehow a manger. So the poor creature lay down and went to sleep. If Friday, Good Friday, if Friday, as he will be named, is the Jesus figure, then Robinson, like Moreau on his island, is making himself the god. Then comes a paragraph in which Robinson expatiates on the appearance of this savage and sees him as extraordinarily handsome because he does not have Negro features, but rather, despite his dark skin, the more elegant and refined features of a European. We see exactly where Robinson's prejudices lie. And then, he awoke and came out of the cave to me. Speaking of Jesus. For I had been milking my goats, which I had in the enclosure just by, when he espied me, and he came running to me, laying himself down upon the ground, with all the possible signs of an humble, thankful disposition, making a great many antic gestures to show it, At last he lays his head flat upon the ground close to my foot, and sets my other foot upon his head, as he had done before, and after this made all the signs to me of subjection, servitude, and submission imaginable, to let me know that he would serve me so long as he lived. Now, I must say, I can understand how one can take those physical signs to imply subjection and servitude, but how did Robinson infer that this meant as long as he shall live? Clearly, Robinson is projecting onto the man just as he is projected onto the island, recreating a system of European slavery within a European geography. I understood him in many things, and let him know I was very well pleased with him. In a little time, I began to speak to him, and teach him to speak to me. And first, I let him know his name should be Friday, rather than asking him his name. This is complete imposition, which was the day I saved his life. I called him so for the memory of the time. I likewise taught him to say, Master, and then let him know that was to be my name. I likewise taught him to say yes and no, and to know the meaning of them. I gave him some milk in an earthen pot, and let him see me drink it before him, and sop my bread in it, and gave him a cake of bread to do the same, which he quickly complied with, and made signs that it was very good for him. I kept there with him all that night, but as soon as it was day, I beckoned him to come with me, and let him know I would give him some clothes, at which he seemed very glad, for he was stark naked. And so Friday is expelled from the garden, and knows his nakedness as Adam and Eve did. This key passage in Robinson Crusoe shows us not only the connection between science fiction and religion, between the ideas of God and the garden and so on, but that the science is often used, certainly in Verne's Voyages extraordinaires, not so much to improve the world as to make the world over again as it was in Europe. Stanislaw Lem says that to become a true Robinson, the world exactly as it is found must be put to rights. Verne always admired America, perhaps because it was putting to rights a whole continent. Verne made America prominent in his novels. From the Earth to the Moon, for example, pays homage to Poe. It is a trip by ballistic rocket to the moon that is launched by an organization called the Baltimore Gun Club, after Poe's association with Baltimore. It turns out, people will say, isn't this wonderful prediction on Verne's part, that this rocket takes off from what is almost exactly the location of Cape Canaveral today? Well, anyone who knows Florida geology, as Verne did, knows that if you go down about 5 feet at the place of Cape Canaveral, you're below the water level. Verne's rocket is in a hole 500 feet deep. He knew that it would be flooded. He's making fun of the Americans. Also, he knew that a ballistic rocket, that is one that goes off with an initial bang rather than has a rocket engine that propels it, will create a change of velocity so great that human beings would be squashed and killed. This is a satire, in fact. Around the World in 80 Days not only has a maiden saved, but a Native American maiden saved by these gallant Europeans. The ship that went around the world in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, as I said, is the Abraham Lincoln, and commanded by a hero of the U.S. Civil War. In The Mysterious Island, 1875, we are with a group of Northern prisoners who have escaped by balloon from a Confederate prison camp, and they are helped by a mysterious someone they never get to see, sort of like Rumpelstiltskin. And it turns out that this someone they never get to see is, again, our old friend, Captain Nemo. In the Begum's Millions, Verne puts two competing communities on the Olympic Peninsula opposite Seattle. In the Olympic Mountains, on opposing mountaintops, we find Frankville, the French ideal state, and Stahlstadt, the German ideal state. And as their economies churn along, they come into inevitable conflict. Now, Germany won the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 71, But in this 1879 novel, guess which ideal state wins on the American continent? Verne's work, if not the man, traveled and imposed itself everywhere. After Agatha Christie, according to the United Nations listing of most translated authors, he is the most translated author in all of human history. Around the World in 80 Days was the very first Western novel translated into Japanese. He, in fact, helped to Europeanize Japanese culture. And the message he carries of teasing, stereotypical satire, enthusiasm for science, and often the wonder of America is the message that underlies one of the two great strands of science fiction.